I'm Anna, and I became a mom of 2 children at 19. And this isn't a love story or a tale of wrong choices. It's a story of difficult choices I made to fix other people's mistakes. When people hear that, they usually smile politely, thinking I'm joking or exaggerating. I don't correct them. It's easier to let them believe everything started when I was 19. But the truth began much earlier, in a house where shouting was louder than laughter and silence was the safest sound to hide behind. My father, Frank, ruled that house like it was his small kingdom. Every meal, every word, even how I sat at the table, everything had its rule. He didn't need to raise his hand often. His voice and that heavy look were enough to make me freeze. But when he did, it left marks. Not just on skin, but somewhere deeper, where bruises never fade. My mother, Connie, used to be soft and warm when I was little. I still remember the mornings when she braided my hair and sang quietly like she was trying to protect me from the chaos waiting to wake up in the next room. But those mornings became rare. At first it was 1 glass of wine to calm down. Then 2, then she stopped pretending it was for anything else. They argued about everything: money, mistakes, who ruined whose life. I learned to make myself invisible. I'd sit in my room with the door half closed, holding my breath every time I heard the sound of breaking glass. Sometimes I imagined that if I stayed quiet enough, the walls would forget I existed and wouldn't give me away when my father started searching for something to blame. I used to think all families were like that. My classmates talked about bedtime stories and weekend picnics, and I nodded like I understood. In reality, the only stories I heard were shouted through the walls, the kind that left you tired even when you were a child. Still, there were moments, short ones, when Mom would wake up sober and remember she loved me. She'd hold my face and say, "You're my strong girl, Anna." I clung to those words like they could keep me safe. But every time I believed her, she'd disappear again into the smell of alcohol and apologies that meant nothing. I never hated her, not even then. I just felt invisible. To my father, I was a reminder of everything he wanted to control. To my mother, I was the last thing she had strength to handle. Sometimes I wonder how a child can grow up in a house full of people and still feel completely alone. Maybe that's where my strength started. In the quiet places between their fights, when no one came to check if I was okay. That's how my story really begins. Long before I became a mother, I was already learning what it means to raise yourself. When I was 10, my mother packed 2 suitcases and told me we were leaving. She didn't cry, didn't explain, just said we deserved a better life. I remember standing by the window, watching my father's car disappear down the street, not knowing if I was supposed to feel relieved or scared. Maybe both. The trip felt like freedom at first. We drove for hours, and for the first time, the air inside the car didn't smell like anger. Mom kept the windows open, her hair flying in the wind, a cigarette in one hand, music turned up too loud. She looked almost happy, like she was running from a fire and believed we'd finally outrun the smoke. We moved into a small apartment in another state. It wasn't much, but it was ours, and for a while I believed we'd start over. Mom promised me school would be different, that she'd get a job and stop drinking, and for a few weeks she tried. She made breakfast, laughed at the TV, called me her little roommate. I started to believe in her again. But then, the bottles came back. Hidden at first, then openly left on the counter. I learned to read her eyes. When they were clear, she was my mother. When they weren't, I stayed out of her way. The promises faded with every hangover. Then one day, she met a man. His name was Gary. He was friendly at first, the kind who smiles too much and tells you you're special even when he's not looking at you. He started coming around often, bringing takeout and cheap flowers. Mom said he made her feel young again. I didn't say anything. I just noticed she drank more when he was around. A few months later, she told me she was pregnant. I was 11. She said it like good news, but her eyes looked scared. I didn't understand why at first, until Gary stopped visiting, then came back drunk, shouting, and sometimes didn't come back at all. The fight started again. Different voices, but the same echoes. And I was invisible again. Just older, quieter, better at pretending I didn't care. When the baby was born, everything changed. My mom held him like she'd finally found the love she'd been missing all her life. I didn't blame her, but it hurt watching her forget I existed. She stopped asking how school was. I stopped trying to tell her. I became the one who cooked when she passed out, who made sure the baby didn't cry too loud. I learned how to heat formula and change diapers while my mom slept through afternoons. Sometimes, when she woke up sober, she'd thank me and say I was her little helper. But she never noticed how fast I was growing up, how each day I became less her daughter and more her shadow. I wanted to believe she'd get better once the baby came, that she'd finally have a reason to stop drinking. But instead she drifted further away, lost somewhere between bottles and broken promises. That was the first time I realized that love, by itself, doesn't fix people. Sometimes, it only keeps you close enough to get hurt again. I was 12 when my mother told me I was going back to my father. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like it was for my own good. But I knew what it really meant. She was tired of me, tired of my questions, my anger, my reminders of who she used to be. By then, things at home were worse than ever. Gary had come back and they both drank almost every night. The baby cried for hours, the rent was overdue, and I was the only one who noticed. I tried to help, to clean, to cook, but at some point, I started to talk back, to ask why. Why we didn't have food, why she let him treat her that way, why she couldn't stop drinking. She didn't like that version of me. The quiet little helper had turned into a problem. The day she told me I was leaving, she didn't even look me in the eye. "You need structure, Anna. Your father can give you that. I can't handle you right now," she said, holding a half-empty glass of something brown. I wanted to scream that it wasn't structure I needed, it was a mother. But I didn't. I just stood there, feeling like I was being erased again. She packed my things in one bag. I remember how light it felt, like I didn't own much more than a few clothes and the pieces of myself that no one wanted. When Frank's car stopped in front of the house, everything in me froze. He stepped out, still the same, iron shirt, straight posture, that cold look that could cut through anything. He didn't hug me. He didn't even ask how I'd been. He just took the bag from my hand, threw it into the trunk and said, "Let's go." On the way back, I watched the road through the window and tried not to cry. I told myself that maybe this time would be different, that maybe he'd changed, but deep down I knew he hadn't. Some people never do. At the next red light, he finally spoke. "Your mother's ruining her life," he said flatly. "You'll learn some discipline now." That's all. No welcome back. No, I missed you. Just a warning. Back at his house, everything smelled of order, lemon cleaner and silence. Norma, his new wife, greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She told me how lovely it was to have me back, how she'd help me settle in, and for a moment, I wanted to believe her. But something about the way she looked at me, too sweet, too measured, made me uneasy. That night, I lay in the same room I'd slept in years ago, staring at the ceiling, listening to the clock tick. I felt like a guest in my own life. Somewhere far away, my mom was pregnant again, starting another family, another chance. I wondered if she'd tell that baby about me, if she'd say she had a daughter once who was too difficult to love. I didn't know it yet, but that day was the last time I'd ever call her Mom. At first, life with Dad and Norma felt almost peaceful. After everything I'd been through with Mom and Gary, the clean house, regular meals, and strict order almost felt like stability. Norma was kind to me in the beginning. She'd ask about school, help me braid my hair, even bake cookies on Sundays, always when Dad was home. She smiled a lot then, called me sweetheart, and told my father how smart and polite I was. For a few months, I thought maybe this time I'd finally get to have a real family. But kindness like hers doesn't last, not when it's just a mask. When Dad left for work, her voice changed. Soft words turned sharp. The first time I noticed it, I thought I'd imagined it. I asked her if she could help me with homework, and she sighed, saying, "Can't you see I'm busy? You always need something." It was small, almost invisible. But it kept happening. little things that made me doubt myself. She'd say, "You forgot to clean the kitchen," even when I knew I did. Or she'd move my things and then accuse me of being careless. And if I ever tried to explain, she'd tilt her head, look sad, and whisper, "I'm only trying to help you, Anna. Why are you being so defensive?" In front of Dad, she was perfect. She'd tell him how proud she was of me, how hard I worked. She'd make my favorite dinner and talk about how much closer we were becoming. And I'd sit there, silent, pretending everything was fine, because I already knew what would happen if I said otherwise. Dad believed her every word. To him, Norma was the gentle balance he never had with Mom. He couldn't see how she twisted things when he wasn't looking. I remember one night when I broke a plate. It slipped from my hands and shattered across the floor. Norma gasped, held her hand to her chest, and said, "Frank, she did it on purpose. I told her to be careful." I tried to explain, but Dad's eyes darkened. He didn't shout, not right away. He just looked at me the way he used to, like I was proof that everything he feared about failure had come true. He made me pick up the pieces with my bare hands. "You need to learn respect," he said. My fingers bled, but I didn't cry, not in front of him. After that, I learned to keep my distance. I did what I was told, stayed quiet, and made sure not to give Norma any reason to save herself by blaming me. Sometimes she'd sit next to me on the couch when Dad was around, put her arm around my shoulders and say, "We're getting along so much better, aren't we, Anna?" And I'd nod, because that's what was expected. But behind those painted smiles and polite words, there was a Cold War only she and I knew existed. I used to wonder why she needed me to be the villain in her story. Maybe she liked being the victim, the fragile wife who endured the moody teenage girl and still managed to keep the house perfect. Or maybe she just enjoyed control the same way my father did. Either way, I understood one thing. Love in that house always had conditions. And I'd already failed too many tests to expect another chance. I was 16 when I made my first real mistake. Or at least the first one that cost me more than I expected. It happened in the most ordinary way. After school one day, a few of my friends were smoking behind the gym. I didn't even like it. The smell made me dizzy. But I wanted to know what it felt like to do something that was mine. Something I wasn't told or forbidden to do. So I took one cigarette. Just one. I kept it in my jacket pocket for days, not even smoking it, just touching it sometimes like it was a secret no one else could control. Then Norma found it. I'd left my jacket hanging over the chair. When I came back from the kitchen, she was holding the cigarette between two fingers, staring at it like she'd found proof of a crime. "What's this, Anna?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp around the edges. I panicked. I said it wasn't mine, that a friend put it there. She smiled, that cold, knowing smile, and said, "Don't lie to me, sweetheart. I'm not your enemy. I won't tell your father, okay?" I begged her not to. I said I was sorry, that I'd throw it away, that it would never happen again. She nodded, even patted my arm. "I believe you," she said. "Let's forget it ever happened." I almost cried with relief. I thanked her. I wanted so badly to believe she could be kind. That night I went to bed early. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe. But sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of the door slamming open. Before I could even sit up, the light flashed on. And there he was. Dad stood in the doorway, his face red, his eyes full of the kind of anger that doesn't need words. In his hand, he held the cigarette. He didn't say a thing at first. Just looked at me, the way he used to when I was little, like I was something he needed to fix. Then he shouted, "You think you can lie to me?" And before I could answer, his hand came down. I don't remember how many times. I remember the sound more than the pain, the heavy, sharp rhythm of his anger filling the room. I remember the shock of it, how my body froze while my mind kept whispering, he promised he'd never hit me again. Norma stood by the door. She didn't stop him. She just watched, her hand pressed to her chest, whispering, "Frank, please stop," in that soft, helpless tone she used when she wanted to look innocent. Eventually, he left. The house went quiet again, but I couldn't close my eyes. I stared at the ceiling until morning, shaking so hard the blanket trembled with me. The next day, I packed a small bag and left. No plan, no goodbye. I just walked to the bus station with a few dollars in my pocket and one thought repeating in my head, I can't stay here anymore. When the bus stopped in my mother's town, I didn't even know what I'd say to her. I just hoped she'd open the door. She did. And when she saw me standing there with swollen eyes and a bruise on my cheek, she didn't ask a single question. She just said, "You can sleep on the couch." It wasn't comfort, but it was enough. For that moment, enough was all I needed. Life with my mother again wasn't what I imagined. When I left my father's house, I thought I was running toward safety. Instead, I ran into a different kind of chaos. One that didn't scream as loud, but hurt just the same. Mom lived in a small apartment with Gary and my two little brothers, Jim and Jack. They were still tiny, always crying, always hungry, always covered in crumbs and chocolate stains. The place smelled of cigarette smoke and sour milk. Bottles clinked every time someone moved. There wasn't a single day without drinking. Morning coffee was mixed with vodka, and dinner was just an excuse to open another bottle. Gary slept through most afternoons, and when he was awake, he shouted about money or the noise. At first, I tried to help. I fed the boys, changed them, read to them before bed. Jim was wild even then, always breaking something or testing limits. Jack was quieter, shy, and used to hide behind my leg whenever voices got too loud. I loved them in a way I'd never been loved, fully, without expecting anything back. Maybe that's why I stayed. But after a while, exhaustion took over. No matter how much I did, it was never enough. Mom still yelled, Gary still drank, and I started to disappear into the background again. It felt like reliving my childhood. Only this time, I was the adult trying to hold the walls up. I remember coming home from school one day and the boys were crying. Mom was passed out on the couch, an empty bottle on the floor. I cleaned up the mess, made them sandwiches, and sat there watching cartoons with them until they stopped sobbing. When Gary finally came home, he looked at me and said, "You think you're their mother now?" I didn't answer. That night I went to bed thinking maybe I should just leave. But where would I go? Eventually, I found a way. One of my classmates, Emma, noticed the bruises under my eyes, not from hits, but from sleepless nights. She invited me over once, and her parents were kind, too kind. They had dinner together, laughed, asked me questions like I mattered. That's how it started. One visit that became 2, then 3. Soon, I was spending more nights at Emma's place than at home. I'd tell Mom I was staying late for school projects. She didn't care enough to ask. Once, I didn't come home for 3 days, and when I finally walked in, she just looked up from the couch and said, "You're back." No anger, no surprise, just emptiness. I think that's when I truly understood what being alone meant. Not the silence, not the distance, but the moment when no one notices whether you're there or not. Emma's parents started paying me a few dollars to babysit their younger kids. That's how I earned my first money. I liked it, being useful, being seen. Their home wasn't perfect, but it was warm, and for a while I let myself pretend it was mine too. At 16, I was already living 2 lives, one that no one cared about, and one that wasn't really mine but gave me hope. And even though I didn't know it then, that hope, small as it was, would soon become the reason I survived everything that came next. When I turned 17, I decided I'd never depend on anyone again. No one was coming to save me. I'd learned that already, so I started looking for ways to save myself. My first job was at a supermarket. It wasn't much, stacking shelves, cleaning floors, smiling at customers who never looked twice at me. But when I got my first paycheck, even though it was small, I felt something I hadn't felt before: control. I could buy food without asking, take a bus somewhere without needing permission. For the first time in my life, I wasn't completely powerless. I kept the job after school, working weekends and late evenings. It was exhausting, but it gave me purpose. My mother didn't notice. I doubt she even knew where I worked. But I didn't care. Her silence gave me freedom. One afternoon, Emma's dad came to pick her up after school. He owned a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. I helped him carry a few boxes and we started talking. He asked if I was still working at the supermarket. I nodded and he said, "You seem like a hard worker. I could use an extra pair of hands at the shop if you're interested." That's how everything changed. I started there part-time, wiping down tools, sweeping the floor, handing him wrenches. But I was curious. I asked questions, watched closely, and learned fast. He repaired car interiors, leather seats, dashboards, steering wheels, and one day, he let me try fixing a small tear. My hands were steady, and I had patience, maybe because I'd spent years trying not to break under pressure. He smiled and said, "You've got a feel for this, Anna." That was the first real compliment I'd ever believed. He started teaching me more, how to sew seams, match textures, blend colors until the repair disappeared completely. I loved it. There was something peaceful about it, taking something damaged and making it whole again. Maybe it reminded me of myself. Soon, I was earning enough to leave Emma's couch and rent a tiny room above a bakery. The room was small, just a bed, a sink, and a window that faced the street, but it was mine. No shouting, no bottles, no one pretending to love me, just quiet. I could finally breathe. Around that time, I met Liam. He worked at a nearby hardware store. He was only a year older than me, kind, with messy hair and that easy smile people have when they've never had to grow up too fast. We met when I came in to buy thread and glue for the shop. He joked that I looked too young to fix cars. I told him I looked older when covered in dust and oil. He laughed, and then he asked for my number. We started spending evenings together, grabbing coffee, walking by the river, talking about everything and nothing. He was gentle in a way I wasn't used to. When he asked about my family, I said they lived far away. He didn't push. I liked that about him. He didn't try to fix me. He just let me be. Those were quiet, good days. For once, life felt almost normal. I was learning, working, earning, and being seen. Not as someone's problem, not as a burden, but as myself. And though I didn't know it then, that fragile peace wouldn't last long. Because sometimes, life doesn't ask if you're ready before it gives you a new test. I turned 19 on the train. The seat next to me was empty, and the window showed a blur of fields and small towns that all looked the same. Quiet, ordinary, untouched by everything I'd lived through. I was going back to my hometown for a short educational course. 3 weeks of training on leather restoration and upholstery. My boss had arranged it for me, said it would help me move up in the business. I was proud of that. Proud that someone finally saw potential in me, not just responsibility. Still, as the train rolled closer to the city where I grew up, my chest tightened. It had been years since I'd last been there, since the night my father beat me while I slept. I hadn't spoken to him since. But as the familiar streets came into view, I realized how strange it felt to return to the place that built me and broke me at the same time. When I got off the train, the air felt colder. Maybe it was just the memories. The course was held in a small technical center not far from the street where we used to live. During lunch breaks, I'd sit outside with coffee, watching people hurry by. They looked normal, calm, steady, like they never had to run away from anyone. I wondered what that kind of life felt like. That night, sitting alone in the rented room, I stared at my phone for a long time. I don't know what pushed me to do it. Maybe loneliness, maybe habit. But I found my father's number. I hadn't saved it under Dad for years, just under his name. Frank. My fingers hesitated before pressing call. I told myself I just wanted to know if he was okay. But deep down, I think I wanted to know if he'd ever missed me. He answered on the third ring. His voice was the same, deep, steady, like the world couldn't shake him. "Hello?" "Hi, it's Anna." There was a pause. Not awkward, just heavy. "Oh," he said finally. "Well, it's been a while." We talked for 10 minutes, about nothing important. Work, weather, the course. He didn't mention that night, and I didn't either. It was like we'd silently agreed to pretend it never happened. He told me Norma was doing fine, that the house looked the same, that he'd started gardening. I imagined him out there, watering flowers with the same hands that once scared me, and I didn't know how to feel. When we hung up, I sat there staring at the phone. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was something else. A strange kind of relief. Maybe because even if he hadn't changed, he was still there. My mother, on the other hand, was gone long before she disappeared. Every call with her ended in slurred words or tears or silence. She'd tell me she missed me, then ask for money. Sometimes I sent a little. Not because I trusted her, but because I couldn't stand the thought of her starving. I realized then that I wasn't really looking for a parent. I was looking for someone who could still stand on their own feet. Someone solid enough for me to lean on, even for a moment. And maybe that's why I called my father that night. Not because I forgave him, but because he was the only person I had left who still sounded sober. It was the third evening of my course when my phone rang. An unknown number flashed on the screen. For a second, I thought it might be my father. Maybe he'd changed his mind and wanted to see me. But when I answered, the voice on the other end was small, shaky, and achingly familiar. Anna? It was Jim, my little brother. Except his voice didn't sound little anymore. It sounded scared in the way only children can be when they've already seen too much. Jim, what's wrong? I asked. There was a long pause before he said, Mom's gone. She and Dad. They left 3 days ago. At first, I didn't understand. What do you mean gone? Where? I don't know, he whispered. They went out at night and never came back. We thought they'd be home in the morning, but... His voice broke. We don't have any food left, Anna. Jack's hungry. I gave him crackers, but they're gone now. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, the phone pressed against my ear, my mind refusing to believe what I was hearing. I asked a few more questions, trying to piece it together. They hadn't eaten properly in days. The fridge was empty except for a bottle of ketchup and half a loaf of stale bread. They'd run out of electricity because the bill hadn't been paid. The neighbors didn't know or didn't care. He said, I tried to call Mom, but her phone's off. I didn't know who else to call. And then quieter. Can you come get us? Something inside me cracked. I didn't cry. I just sat down slowly, holding the phone with both hands like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. All the memories I'd tried to bury, the shouting, the drinking, the nights I spent taking care of them, came rushing back at once. And now, it was happening again, only worse. They were alone, and they called me. I promised him I'd figure something out. I told him to stay inside, lock the doors, and keep Jack close. He said, okay, in a small, tired voice, then hung up. I stared at the phone for a long time, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out every thought. I wanted to call the police, but then I imagined social services stepping in, splitting them up, sending them to strangers. I couldn't let that happen. They were my brothers. I dialed Liam next. He answered right away. Anna, everything okay? No, I said quietly. Can you help me? Please. I need you to bring food to my mom's house. The boys are alone. He didn't hesitate. I'll go right now. After I hung up, I sat by the window and watched the city lights blur into streaks. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew one thing. I couldn't leave them there. For hours, I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to think like an adult even though I still felt like a lost child. I thought about Mom, wherever she was, probably too drunk to remember she had children waiting at home. I thought about my father, who had stopped being anyone's safe place long ago. And then I thought about Jim and Jack, hungry, scared, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. That night, I didn't sleep. But somewhere between the ticking of the clock and the breaking of dawn, I made a decision that would change everything. If no one else was going to be their parent, I would. When I came back home, the air smelled like rain and gasoline. The train felt endless, but my thoughts ran faster than it ever could. I didn't have a plan, just a decision. And sometimes, that's enough to start a new life. Liam met me at the station. He looked worried, like he was afraid to say the wrong thing. "I brought the groceries," he said quietly. There were bags full of food, cereal, milk, bread, things I hadn't thought about in days. He didn't ask questions. He just drove. When we reached my mother's house, I saw the curtains closed, lights off. The boys ran to the door the moment they heard the car. Jim's face lit up for a second, but then he looked behind me and asked, "Where's Mom?" She'll come back later," I said, because the truth would only make the silence heavier. The house was a mess. Empty bottles, dirty dishes, the smell of something rotten in the sink. I cleaned for hours while Liam cooked pasta for the boys. They ate like they hadn't eaten in a week. Maybe they hadn't. That night, after I put them to bed, Liam and I sat in the kitchen with the lights off. I told him everything. The call, the empty house, how Mom was gone again. He didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he said quietly, "You can't leave them here." "I know," I said. My voice didn't even shake. He took a deep breath. "Then let's find a place. I'll help." The next morning, we started searching. It didn't take long to find a small 2-room apartment near the edge of town. Cheap, a little run down, but safe. Liam paid the first month's rent and helped me buy an old couch, a few mattresses, some dishes. I didn't have much, but it was enough to start a home. 2 days later, I came back for the boys. They were sitting on the floor with their backpacks like they already knew. Jim tried to act brave, but Jack held my hand so tight his fingers turned white. As we drove away, they didn't look back. Maybe because there was nothing to look back to. When she saw me, she smiled, that sleepy, broken smile I'd seen too many times before. "Anna," she said slowly, "you came." "Where were you?" I asked. "The boys were alone for a week." She took a sip from her glass and shrugged. "It's for the better," she said, her voice soft, almost gentle. "You're stronger than me. They'll be better off with you." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Not because I was angry, I'd already run out of anger years ago, but because she said it like she was giving me a gift, not a burden. I wanted to scream, to ask how a mother could just hand over her children and go back to her drink. But instead, I just stood there and nodded. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Maybe you're right." When I walked out of that house, I didn't cry. I just felt empty. The kind of emptiness that comes right before strength. By the time I got back to the apartment, the boys were asleep on the floor, surrounded by their new blankets and the smell of pasta. The window was open, the city lights flickering outside. For the first time, it felt like home, not because it was perfect, but because we were together. That night, I sat on the floor beside them and whispered, "It's okay now. I've got you." And even though I was only 19 and terrified of what came next, I meant every word. Life didn't suddenly become easier when I took the boys. It just became mine. The first few months were hard, harder than anything I'd ever done. The bills came faster than I could earn, and the boys were still learning how to trust that dinner would always be on the table. But for the first time, the chaos in my life had a purpose. Every morning when I woke up and saw them sleeping, I reminded myself, this is why I'm here. I went back to work at the auto repair shop. My boss didn't hesitate when I asked for more hours. He knew I needed the money, and he respected the way I worked. Quiet, focused, grateful. I started taking extra jobs too, small repairs at home, handbags, jackets, old leather couches. People from the neighborhood began to bring me things to fix. Sometimes I'd stay up half the night sewing in the dim light, the hum of the sewing machine mixing with the soft breathing of the boys in the next room. My hands hurt, my eyes burned, but when I looked at the pile of bills on the table, rent, groceries, electricity, I knew it was worth it. Money was always tight, but it never ran out completely. I'd learned long ago how to stretch every coin. Pasta, soup, secondhand clothes, simple things, but we never went hungry. I taught Jim and Jack to say thank you for everything, even for what little we had. Liam helped me at first. He brought groceries, fixed things in the apartment, made the boys laugh when I was too tired to smile. He was good to them. gentle, patient. But I could see in his eyes that this wasn't the life he had imagined for himself at 20. He'd talk about concerts, trips, things he wanted to do, and I'd listen while folding laundry or checking homework. We were the same age, but we lived in different worlds now. I carried rent receipts and doctor's bills in my bag. He carried dreams. One evening, he came over after work. The boys were watching cartoons on the floor, and I was mending a jacket with torn sleeves. He sat next to me quietly for a while, then said, "You've changed, Anna." I didn't look up. I had to. He nodded. "I know, I don't know where I fit anymore." I wanted to tell him I still cared, that I wished we could go back to the days when life was light and simple. But love can't grow in exhaustion, and he deserved someone who wasn't constantly dividing herself between work, rent, and two little souls depending on her. So I said softly, "Maybe you don't have to fit anymore." We didn't fight. There were no tears, no final words, just a long, quiet understanding. He hugged me goodbye, kissed the boys on the head, and left. I thought it would break me, but instead, it left a kind of peace. I realized that not everyone who leaves does it out of selfishness. Some just can't walk the same road you're forced to take. After that, I stopped waiting for help. I worked more, saved more, fixed more. The apartment slowly filled with life, mismatched chairs, hand-me-down toys, the smell of glue and leather. The walls were still bare, but the laughter was real. Sometimes, when I watched the boys sleep, I thought about my mother, how she must have felt the first time she realized she couldn't handle me. I still didn't understand her, but I understood how easy it was to break when no one ever showed you how to stay whole. But I wasn't going to be her. I couldn't afford to be. Every stitch I made, every repair I finished, every bill I paid, it all reminded me that strength isn't loud. It's the quiet promise you keep when no one else is watching. People like to say that children are innocent, that they just need love and everything will turn out fine, but they never tell you what to do when that love isn't enough. Jim and Jack were still kids, 9 and 7, but they already carried more chaos inside them than I could handle some days. Years of neglect don't just disappear because someone finally tucks you in at night. Jim fought with everyone, teachers, neighbors, me. He slammed doors, shouted that he hated rules, refused to do homework. Sometimes I saw my father in the way he clenched his jaw when he was angry, and it scared me. Jack was softer, but he lied constantly, about broken dishes, missing coins, bad grades. Maybe he thought lying was safer than disappointing someone. I understood that too well. There were days when I thought I was failing them. I didn't know how to be a mother. No one had ever shown me what love with boundaries looked like. I was making it up as I went, half instinct, half desperation. Once Jim got into a fight at school. The principal called me in and said, "He pushed another boy into the mud. We can't tolerate aggression here." I wanted to say, "He learned that from life itself." But instead, I apologized, took Jim's hand, and walked him home in silence. At home, he sat on the couch, refusing to look at me. I was tired, too tired to shout. So I just said, "I know you're angry, but you're not your dad, Jim. You get to choose who you become." He didn't answer, but that night, when he thought I was asleep, he came into my room and whispered, "I'm sorry." That was enough. Jack, on the other hand, needed gentleness. He clung to me so tightly that sometimes I couldn't move without him following. He asked me the same question every night before bed. "You're not going anywhere, right?" And every time, I'd stroke his hair and promise, "No, baby, I'm right here." Some nights, I'd sit between their beds and watch them breathe, their small chests rising and falling, and I'd feel this strange mix of exhaustion and peace. I was barely holding everything together, bills, work, life. But at least they were safe. I didn't always know what I was doing. Sometimes I lost my temper, shouted, cried in the bathroom, then came out pretending to be calm. But I never stopped trying. I never walked away like others did. And slowly, things began to change. Jim stopped breaking things just to get attention. Jack started sleeping without checking if I was still there. They still fought, still tested limits, but there was trust growing between us. Fragile but real. One evening after dinner, they both helped me clean up without me asking. Jim washed the plates, Jack wiped the table. It sounds small, but to me, it felt like victory. That night, I sat by the window sewing a car seat cover for extra money, and I caught my reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, calloused hands, but peace. I realized I didn't regret a single thing. Yes, my life was hard. I worked more than I slept. I didn't have friends my age, or nights out, or plans for the future beyond the next month's bills. But when I looked at those boys, I saw something I'd never had. A family built on love, not fear. They didn't grow up rich or spoiled, but they grew up knowing that home was a safe place, and that was everything I ever wanted to give them. Sometimes, when the house was quiet, I'd think about the path that led me here. The violence, the drinking, the loneliness. All of it had shaped me, but it hadn't broken me. I wasn't the perfect mother. But I was present, and that, I'd learned, was what love really meant. After a while, my mother simply disappeared. No goodbye, no note, not even a rumor of where she'd gone. One day she was still somewhere out there, and then she just wasn't. At first, I kept checking my phone, half expecting her name to flash on the screen. I imagined she'd called drunk at midnight, crying and apologizing the way she used to. But the days turned into months, and silence replaced her voice. Eventually, I stopped waiting. It's strange how people can vanish but still leave a shadow behind. I didn't hate her anymore. I think I just finally accepted that some people are born too fragile for life. She was one of them. Around that time, I started speaking to my father again. It happened by accident, a short call about some paperwork that turned into small talk about the weather, then about work, then about nothing at all. He was still the same, strict, distant, always right. He had a way of speaking that made every conversation feel like an exam I hadn't studied for, but I kept calling him. I don't even know why. Maybe because I needed someone who still existed, someone who carried the same last name. Sometimes he'd ask about the boys, and I could hear something softer in his voice, almost like pride. "You've done well," he'd say. And those 3 words, coming from him, felt like a lifetime's worth of approval. I never argued with him, not anymore. Even when I disagreed, I nodded, said, "You're right, Dad." It wasn't about submission, it was survival. I'd learned long ago that peace with him was built on agreement, and honestly, I didn't have the energy to fight. I just needed to know that I had someone, even if that someone was difficult. Liam still called sometimes back then. We had ended things quietly, like 2 people who cared but no longer belonged in the same picture. He'd ask about work, about the boys, about whether I was sleeping enough. He was seeing someone new. I could tell from the way his tone softened when he talked about his evenings. I smiled when he mentioned her. "She's lucky," I told him once, and I meant it. Our relationship didn't break, it just faded. He needed someone light, someone who could go to concerts on weekends and talk about plans without thinking about rent. I couldn't be that person anymore. My world was smaller, heavier, filled with responsibility instead of possibilities. We promised to stay friends, and we did. Sometimes he dropped by with toys for the boys or coffee for me. We'd talk for an hour, and when he left, the apartment felt a little warmer. He never judged me for the life I had. But he also never asked to be part of it again, and I respected that. By then, my days all looked the same. Work, dinner, laundry, bedtime stories. My hands were rough from leather and glue, but my heart was steady. I didn't have much family left, but the boys had me. And in some quiet way, I still had my father, not as a comfort, but as a reminder that I wasn't completely alone in the world. Sometimes I wondered if he ever regretted the past, the nights when anger spoke louder than love. But I never asked. We'd both built our peace on silence, and maybe that was the only way we knew how to care. I don't know where my mother is now. Maybe she's in another town. Maybe she's gone for good. Sometimes, When I pass a woman on the street with tired eyes and shaking hands, I wonder if I'd even recognize her anymore. For a long time, I thought I needed answers, some kind of apology or explanation. But the older I get, the more I understand. Not everyone is built to face life head-on. Some people drown in the same storms that teach others how to swim. My mother wasn't cruel. She was weak. And weakness can look like selfishness when you're standing on the other side of it. I used to be angry at her for leaving me, for choosing the bottle over her children, for all the empty promises. But anger gets heavy when you carry it for too long. So one day I just put it down. I forgave her. Not because she earned it, but because I didn't want to spend my life trying to heal wounds that weren't mine to begin with. Now, when I look at Jim and Jack, taller, calmer, their laughter filling the apartment that once felt too quiet, I know I made the right choices. Every single one of them. Even the hard ones, especially the hard ones. I don't regret a thing. I may not have had the childhood I wanted, but I gave these boys the one they deserved, and that's enough for me. Sometimes I dream about the future. A bigger house, maybe a small workshop of my own, a garden where the boys can play after school. Simple things, peaceful things, the kind of life that once felt impossible. I'm not sure what comes next, but I know this much. I'm not afraid anymore, because I've already lived through the worst and turned it into love.